So what is a tragedy anyway? We use the word in a completely different sense today because usually we relate it to television or news stories where some child dies in a particularly horrific or sad way. But that's not what the theatrical definition of tragedy is, nor was it the one that was used in plays in Shakespeare's time and Marlowe's time, and the time of those we're studying in literature. A tragedy involves the main character of a nobleman, and almost always a man. He has some tragic flaw, which means a defect in his personality that somewhere along the line in the play is going to cause him to make a bad decision. And that bad decision consequently leads to the character making a fall, falling from grace, so to speak. And he often, although not always, dies. Consider Hamlet, if you've ever seen a version of Hamlet, where at the very end, during the sword fight scene, not only does Hamlet die, but so does his mother, his stepfather, his former girlfriend's brother, and his former girlfriend died because she committed suicide earlier in the play. So they all die, and the tragedy is not so much in all the death, but it's in the fall of that character. So what is the object of all this? The object is catharsis. In other words, to purge the emotion. And the play is supposed to arouse the emotion of the audience, and then it is let go at the end where they get to cry and they get to feel sad for the main character and get rid of all that extra baggage. So, to tie this all together, we know it's no historical secret that early modern culture, which is what this time was called, early modern, that it was violent. Even though they proclaimed a belief in and a practice of being like someone known as the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ, these believers were anything but peaceful. Roman Catholics tortured and executed Protestants, and likewise, Protestants tortured and executed Roman Catholics. And woe to murderers, thieves, or anyone else, or anyone perceived as a traitor, especially those of the lower classes, for not only would their living bodies be abused, but the abuse wouldn't stop at death. These tortuous executions were public spectacles, rituals of state vengeance, which audiences would flock to. These events, together with all of their signs and symbols, formed a cultural code, an expectation of social behavior in people's relationships with other community members, with the state, and with religious institutions that conceivably could culminate in one's mounting the scaffold if they fell too far away from that code. It's exemplified in plays by Shakespeare and Marlowe, and also in John Fox's Acts and Monuments, which is shown a woodcut here from that book. And that book you might be more familiar with as Fox's Book of Martyrs. So really, any public execution was like a tragedy, a tragic play, and everyone had their parts to play, and there were roles, a plot, how that role was to be played, and they were highly, highly symbolic. And it really all comes down to the state ownership of one's body. If the state tells you you have to surrender your body, you don't own it anyway. And so you have to surrender it. And this is the culture that people lived in at that time. It was the assumption that they made. No one needed to speak it because that was just the way things were. This next image is provided to us by the publishers of your textbook, W. W. Norton. This admittedly horrifying image is of the Spanish Inquisition perpetrated on the Indians of the New World. Now, consider this idea that the state owns one's body. The people who came to the New World and wanted to take over the territory of the Indian people and conceivably to convert them to Christianity came to them with the same assumption that the Indians' bodies also belonged to the monarchy of Spain, because the monarchy of Spain belonged to God. And so, in spite of all the horrible images here, which is what happened to them, these people really thought that they were doing the right thing, because the king and queen by definition cannot be wrong, because they are appointed by God, right? And this is what God is telling them to do. Now you'll notice there's a lot of body parts there. Interestingly, back then there were a lot of taboos that had to do with the body, and there was no anatomy and physiology and no way to find out about human bodies except by seeing what happened to them when they were executed, which I think is part of why these executions were so violent, is because people wanted to see what happened to these bodies. They had no way of knowing otherwise what was inside somebody's stomach, and what happened when somebody cut off a limb or broke a limb. And, macabre as it may sound, it's really curiosity too. And keep in mind that these people just really didn't think that they were doing anything wrong. We realize they are, but they didn't think so. I don't want to dwell here necessarily, but this was a really common method of execution, and it might be mistaken with a method of torture, but people died at the end because they were just left to die at the gallows. And this is what happened to one particular person in Germany, and he is the same person on the wheel in each one of these little scenes. And what happened here is they would break people's bones and then thread them through the wheel. And a couple of slides down, when things begin to change in the Enlightenment, Adam Smith has seen scenes like this over and over again, as have all of the people you are reading about. And he begins to have a different attitude about this when he examines how he feels when he watches scenes like this. And you can tell by what he says that it's all too commonplace.